History sometimes changes in the span of a single month. On March 4th of 1841, a crowd gathered in Washington, D.C. to witness the inauguration of William Henry Harrison, the ninth President of the United States. The weather that day was cold, wet, and miserable. Gray clouds hung over the Capitol, and a steady wind pushed damp air through the streets. Most politicians would have shortened their remarks or stepped indoors. Harrison did neither. Instead, the 68-year-old war hero stood outside without a coat, without a hat, and began delivering what would become the longest inaugural address in American history. For nearly 2 hours, this man spoke. Spectators shifted their weight in the mud while the president-elect continued speaking about Republican virtue, Roman history, and the responsibilities of government. Some in the audience listened with admiration, while others wondered quietly if the speech might never end at all. At the time, it felt like a proud moment for a newly elected leader who had spent decades chasing the presidency. No one realized that his rainy speech would become one of the most famous introductions to a presidency in American history. William Henry Harrison had lived a life full of remarkable chapters long before he stepped into the White House, though. He was born in 1773 in Virginia, and when the American colonies still belonged to Great Britain, of course. His father, Benjamin Harrison V, had signed the Declaration of Independence. In other words, politics and national service were practically written into the family story. It was in his blood. As a young man, Harrison joined the army and quickly found himself fighting on the American frontier. In 1794, he participated in the Battle of Fallen Timbers. It was a major conflict that helped end the Northwest Indian War. His career continued to grow from there. By the early 19th century, he was serving as governor of the Indiana Territory, negotiating treaties that transferred millions of acres of land to the United States. Then came the event that made his name infamous across the country. In 1811, Harrison led American forces against a confederation of Native American tribes led by the Shawnee leader Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa. I am so sorry I'm butchering his name. I do have a little bit of dyslexia, and I do struggle with some of these big words that I'm not overly familiar with. Anyway, this clash became known as the Battle of Tippecanoe. The battle itself was brutal and controversial, but it gave Harrison a nickname that would follow him forever. He became known as Old Tippecanoe. That nickname became political gold decades later. By the time the presidential election of 1840 arrived, Harrison had become the candidate of the Whig Party. His campaign leaned heavily into the image of a rugged frontier hero. Supporters built log cabin displays, handed out campaign souvenirs, and they sang catchy slogans that echoed through towns and cities. Old Tippecanoe was pretty famous. The most famous chant of the campaign was simple, but pretty unforgettable. Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Tyler, of course, being John Tyler. That was Harrison's vice presidential running mate. And the campaign worked. Harrison defeated the incumbent president, Martin Van Buren, and entered the White House with enormous public enthusiasm behind him. But once the celebration ended, the real work of the presidency began. Washington politics in the 1840s was already pretty chaotic. Office seekers crowded the Capitol, hoping to receive governmental positions. Visitors lined up outside the White House. Political allies demanded meetings. Social events filled his calendar. Harrison threw himself into the role with remarkable energy for a man of his age. He met endless streams of visitors, attended gatherings across the city, and frequently walked through Washington to visit local markets and shops. Unfortunately, he also had a habit of ignoring the weather. Washington in late winter can be quite damp and windy and cold. Harrison often stepped outside without proper clothing. On one occasion, he was caught in a rainstorm during a walk and returned to the White House still wearing wet clothes. Within days, he began to feel rather ill. At first, the symptoms seemed minor. Chills, fatigue, a cough, nothing that seemed really threatening for a man who had survived frontier warfare and decades of political battles. Doctors were called and they began treating him according to the medical practices of the 1840s. And of course, some of those treatments would be seen as quite shocking today. Bloodletting was used in an attempt to balance the body. Heated cups were applied to the skin to stimulate circulation. And if you've ever seen this, it looks like it leaves hickeys on the body. Medicines containing opium, camphor, and other substances were administered. Wine and brandy were also given in small doses. The doctors believed that Harrison was suffering from pneumonia in the right lung. Meanwhile, rumors began spreading across Washington. Newspapers printed conflicting reports about the president's health. Some stories claimed that he was improving. Others, I hope that didn't come across, but if it did, that was a terrible mistake on my part. I just had a text message come across and it seems rather inappropriate. Anyway, others hinted that the situation was far more serious. People gathered in public places discussing what might happen if the new president did not recover. Behind the scenes, the truth was becoming increasingly grim. Harrison grew weaker. His breathing became more difficult. At times, he became delirious. Cabinet members and family were summoned to the White House. His wife, Anna, was still in Ohio preparing to travel to Washington when the crisis reached its worst point. She had not yet even moved into the White House. On the night of April 3rd of 1841, Harrison's condition deteriorated rapidly. Shortly after midnight in the early hours of April 4th of 1841, William Henry Harrison died. He had served as a president of the United States for only 31 days, and to this day it remains the shortest presidential administration in American history. His death shocked and shook the country, but it was also creating a constitutional question that had never really been clearly answered. See, the Constitution stated that the vice president would assume the powers of the presidency if the president died. However, the wording left room for interpretation. Did the vice president become the president outright, or did he simply act as a temporary caretaker? We know that answer now, but we didn't then. This story is why we know the answer now. Vice President John Tyler answered that question immediately. He declared that he was now the president of the United States. He was not the acting president. He was not a temporary leader. He was the president. Some political opponents challenged him, but Tyler refused to budge. He took the presidential oath and moved into the White House. That decision established a precedent that would guide the country through future presidential debates and deaths and crises going forward. Decades later, the rule would eventually be formalized in the 25th Amendment, but it didn't happen then. But there was another twist to Harrison's story that historians uncovered long after his death. For generations, people believed that Harrison died because of that cold, rainy inauguration speech. It's a simple story and an easy one to remember. An elderly president stands in the rain too long and catches pneumonia. But modern research suggests something else entirely. In 2014, medical historians studying doctors' notes and White House records discovered something alarming about Washington in 1841. The White House drinking water came from a source located downstream from public sewage. In other words, the water supply may have been contaminated with bacteria that caused typhoid fever or similar illness. Harrison Simpson's symptoms matched what doctors today would recognize as septic shock from enteric fever. If that theory is correct, the president may not have died because of cold weather at all. He may have died because of the water that he drank. After Harrison's death, the nation entered a period of mourning. Cannon fire echoed across Washington. Church bells rang. Houses were draped in black fabric inside. A funeral procession moved slowly through the Capitol. Thousands of people lined the streets while military bands played solemn music. Harrison's coffin was eventually placed in a vault in Washington before later being transported back to Ohio in June of that same year. He was finally buried in North Bend, Ohio, overlooking the Ohio River. William Henry Harrison fought in wars, governed territories, served in Congress, and spent decades pursuing the presidency. Yet the part of his life most people remember today lasted only 1 month. History really can be strange that way. Sometimes the shortest chapters leave the longest echoes. So here's my question for you today. Do you think William Henry Harrison is remembered mainly for his brief presidency? Or do you think his real legacy is the constitutional precedent that followed his death? Let me know what you think in the comments. I would genuinely love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoy stories like this, make sure you follow my Facebook page and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss another deep dive into the strange and surprising moments of our history.